One of the things that I think I had to learn in my job is your patients generally won't be mad if you're 2 to 3 minutes late. And taking 2 to 3 minutes can be the difference of doing a good job and a mediocre job.
Hey, Vetfolio Voice family, I'm so glad you tuned in. We've got a great episode for you featuring Allison Johansson, who was such a kind and humble and just lovely person to talk to. Together, we tackled a well-known but kind of difficult topic to discuss, and that's trauma in veterinary medicine. This profession is often full of joy and fulfillment, but like many healthcare professions, at times, it can also leave us coping with pain and heartbreak. In this episode, Allison and I talked about situations in veterinary medicine that can be a more obvious source of trauma, like hit by cars or dog fights. But we also talked about sources of trauma that may be a little more subtle and kind of add up over time, often without us even realizing it's happening. And in addition, we explored vicarious trauma, which was a term that was new to me, and if I'm explaining this correctly, refers to the emotional weight we carry around when we see others around us navigating difficult situations and difficult emotions. Of course, I am not the mental health expert here, so I'll let Allison explain it from her much more educated and eloquent perspective. I know for me, this conversation went a long way in validating some of the emotions that we experience in our profession, and Allison offered great examples of how to cope with some of these inevitable difficulties in a healthy and mindful way. If you can relate to what we're discussing here, I hope this episode offers you the same validation as well as some comfort and maybe even some healthy coping strategies. We're all in this wonderful, difficult, amazing, and at times gut-wrenching profession together. So let's get real about what we're experiencing and remember to lean on each other from time to time. Like I said, my guest was Allison Johansson, who was just wonderful. So let me go ahead and introduce her and we will get into our talk. As a mental health therapist specializing in supporting veterinarians, Allison has dedicated herself to helping these compassionate professionals build resilience against burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma. Her journey into this field stemmed from a profound admiration for veterinarians and a recognition of the emotional toll their work can take. Allison has a license in clinical social work and utilizes her skills and knowledge around stress and the nervous system to establish quick plans veterinary professionals can use to manage the stress specific to the veterinary field. Continuously seeking professional growth, she stays informed of the latest research in trauma therapy to better serve the veterinary community. She's certified in eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, heart math, and psychedelic-assisted therapy. She has such a warm and inviting presence. I'm so excited to bring you our talk. Let's go ahead and get into it.
Join more than 100,000 learners just like you. Vetfolio is one of the largest providers of continuing education for the animal health community, offering more than 500 race-approved CE courses. Earn veterinary CE anytime, anywhere with Vetfolio. Subscribe today at vetfolio.com.
Well, for this episode, I'm joined by Allison Johansson, and we're going to talk about, kind of mental health and well-being, but from a little bit of a different angle, kind of talking about trauma, which is something we're familiar with in veterinary medicine, but also a word that I hadn't heard until pretty recently, which is vicarious trauma. So I'll stop there because I'm certainly not the expert on this and just say thank you for joining me, Allison. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, I'm super excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. So starting with trauma, certainly, like I said, something we're familiar with in the veterinary profession, but we might be familiar with it from a little bit different point of view than maybe what you're referring to when you talk about trauma. So can we start there with just you telling us what is trauma?
Yeah. So there's the medical trauma that you guys are familiar with. And then there's different forms of mental health trauma. So we refer to them as the big T traumas, which are things that you would call traumatic, the basic trauma. And then there's little T traumas, which are a lot of little things that add up so that we respond in the way that we would if it was a big trauma. So little things pile up throughout life. We never find a place of safety. And now we're in the same place that we would if it was a big T trauma.
Gosh, now my wheels are already turning. I'm like, okay, little T trauma. Let's think of this. Could you give us some examples of some of the things you hear maybe from veterinary professionals that you do see add up over time?
Yeah, I think veterinary school's a little T trauma.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I could agree with that.
I think that's like the basic. And then ethical dilemmas all day long, ongoing stress, people yelling at you, other people's stress. All of these are the little T traumas veterinarians and people in veterinary field experience all day long.
And it makes sense, gosh, here in just like the first couple minutes of us talking, when you say that these little traumas can add up to give you a response similar to if it was a big T trauma, that like, gosh, it just makes so much sense because it really can put all of us in a really tough place mentally, but that can be hard to explain to people because it might not sound like what we're talking about is a big deal. You know, it might be one of those like, well, this is our job. This is what we do. And this is just part of it. But when you say that, it makes a lot of sense to say, yeah, but it adds up over time.
Yeah. And if you think about it, all trauma is your body responding to safety. And so if it's little bits where you're unsafe, but you never have downtime, or it's moving so fast that it's not created, then yeah, your body's going to respond as it's unsafe.
Absolutely. That, like I said, just here in the first few minutes, I'm like, oh, that makes so much sense. So let's switch gears then to vicarious trauma, which I mentioned before. What is vicarious trauma?
So it's the idea that we're actually absorbing someone else's trauma. So that could be the other professionals around you, that could be the handlers around you, that could be the animals around you, but you're experiencing it as if you went through it. So the body sees it or is with it so much so that it actually responds whether you want it to or not in the same exact way.
So is that something that vicarious trauma, is that something that's kind of universal? Like if we're around and exposed to someone else's trauma, then we're going to absorb it. Is it variable person to person, or is there like, you know, some people absorb it a lot, some people absorb it a little? How does it work for individuals?
We don't really understand why, but each situation's a little bit different. So sometimes I'm vicariously traumatized, sometimes I'm not. Obviously, there's some things, if I'm already stressed, if I'm already tired, if I'm already hungry, my body is already in distress, I'm more likely to hold it. But overall, we don't know why sometimes it shows up and sometimes it doesn't. It's talked about a lot with a lot of healthcare professionals. You guys have been skipped over with this conversation of vicarious trauma, maybe because it's animals. I think you guys have kind of been hidden for a long time around the difficulty of the job, a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, it's not all playing with puppies and kittens. Sometimes it is playing with puppies and kittens, and that's the best time. But unfortunately, that does not make up the majority of it.
Yeah, there's a lot of hardness. And if you were an ER nurse or something that's obvious, a paramedic, something people talk about it a lot, unfortunately, just not talked about as much.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I guess maybe because of what we were talking about before, that maybe because it's animals and people relate to animals differently. Certainly in the veterinary field, many of us are, you know, kind of empathic, and we absorb a lot of what goes on around us and the feelings and things of the animals that we're connected to. And we feel very connected to a lot of the animals around us, not as long as we're not burnt out or something like that. And so that makes a lot of sense to other people who also feel that connection and that I guess, yeah, that connection to animals. But I have learned, and I don't understand it, that not everybody feels that connection to animals. So I could see in the general conversation that probably many people can relate to absorbing trauma human to human, but maybe not everybody can understand how that would affect people who feel that connection to animals.
Yeah, and I refer to it as pack animals. Other pack animals are empathetic towards each other sometimes. And
Sure.
we're pack animals, and some of the animals we treat are pack animals. So it would make sense that we would connect similarly in that similar way.
Absolutely. And how do we see, you know, I guess, what would be our cue that we might be experiencing these little T traumas or experiencing vicarious trauma that's affecting us in a negative way?
Yeah, I think there's some obvious things. You start having nightmares, start having difficulty sleeping, certain cases haunt you or you feel like you're reliving them for long periods of time. And then there's some other stuff around being more irritable, feeling like the world's just not a safe place, or we're doomed, or you're doomed, someone else you love is doomed. This level of on guard or hypervigilance, jumpiness, um, those types of things.
Okay. That makes sense. So I'm absorbing that now, going, okay. Because I mean, yeah, like there's a lot going on in the world around us. It can be easy to kind of have that sense of foreboding, but I would imagine there's a difference from just like a general sense of like global warming versus like this is trauma that I'm experiencing in my job.
Absolutely. And some of the news, I think we're all vicariously traumatized from, because there's such a yuck in the news. And then there's job vicarious trauma.
Sure. Yes, I had to block the news app on my phone. I have a very specific route where I get my news because it will just take a toll on you very quickly.
Absolutely.
One way I feel like we in the veterinary field, and it's probably not unique to veterinary medicine. I'm sure it extends to other fields. Kind of a coping mechanism I think is common would be compartmentalization. I know that this is a skill that I've certainly practiced to say, okay, this is bothering me, but there's nothing I can do about it in this moment. Let me put it in this nice little box in my brain and tuck it away until I can do something with this and not just dwell on it and let it ruin everything else that's going on in my day. It's that to me feels like a necessary skill to have. Like some of the things that we have to deal with and experience, I wouldn't be able to deal with if I couldn't compartmentalize to a degree. So can you just comment on compartmentalization? Like, is there a healthy level of it? Should we not be doing it?
I hope you do it, because I don't think you would function well. You can't. It takes a couple weeks to process true big T trauma. So if you can think of that, you still have to see the next patient. You still have to go throughout your day and do stuff. You still have to be a partner and a parent and a friend and all of these things in your life. And sometimes we don't get a ton of downtime. The key here is, do I go back to it? Because if it's just compartmentalized, it starts to store in your body, and then it pokes out in weird times that you don't expect it, and it doesn't make sense. All of a sudden I'm irritable and I don't know why, or all of a sudden I'm having these nightmares and it doesn't make sense, or and then it's not A plus B equals C. It's kind of washed and feels blurry. But if you come back to it, if you on your commute go, gosh, what was today like? You're driving anyway, you might as well. Or if as a team you touch base and say, today was hard. Did anyone notice that? Even if every day's hard, or whatever it means for you to just touch base and say, did I ever, or do I need to come back to this and do something with it? Or is it okay just sitting there?
I'm kind of reflecting now, having experienced burnout in my career. And now that you're talking about some of these ways that this little T trauma manifests, I'm like, yeah, I've had that happen to me where maybe I didn't go back to it, because I can think of periods of time where, I wasn't sleeping well and I was having nightmares and I was dwelling and being irritable, and I couldn't necessarily pinpoint why. And I would imagine that played some sort of a role. But as I'm like having this epiphany now and remembering back to experiencing burnout, I don't think I was aware at the time that that's what was going on and that's what was affecting me. So are there ways that maybe we can kind of turn inward and reflect and say, is this what's going on? Or ways to recognize this when we're in the moment? Because just having experienced some of this, it's not always clear in the moment that that's what's going on.
I think routine's really important in this, and each person's different. People have heard you should meditate for however long a day, or journal, or if you're not the person that's going to do that, you're not going to do it. And so finding what works for you, sometimes it's trying stuff out and seeing if it sticks. But the biggest piece is just awareness that it could be there. Gosh, I'm anxious right now, automatically pulls you back into your body so that it can process it, as opposed to I'm fine, right? The fine word. But finding routine throughout. Every time you take a drink of water, every time you cross a door threshold, where am I at right now? What is happening for me right now is going to start that process of just noticing. And then you can intentionally put it away instead of it subconsciously being put away. And when you intentionally put it away, every time you bring it out doesn't mean it's big, right? Sometimes you bring it back and you're like, no, actually not that big anymore. Just a moment. Let's move on with life. And sometimes you bring it up and you're like, whoa, that's got something happening. Maybe I need to run it out, write it out, whatever it is that you do. And maybe it's just a quick breath, finding little things that work for you and your schedule. Because I wish that I could say that it's going to be our priority, but a lot of times it becomes a priority for a short period of time.
Right. A priority until you feel like you can breathe a little bit easier, and then, we can put that down. Just my own curiosity. I do like to meditate. I'm terrible at it. I have to have like guided meditation that's like, hey, come back, remember to breathe. But I do feel like it's helped me in my day-to-day life, just recognize when, like you said, that feeling like, oh, where did that come from? But recognize it as anxiety, because I've spent some time with those feelings. But I've certainly, as much as I love it, like I have plenty of people around me who are like, I don't know why you do that. Like that doesn't work for me. And I can certainly respect that. So are there techniques, aside from like meditation, I know you mentioned journaling, things like that you've seen people have success with in just taking that pause to be able to, like you said, just come back to the moment and check in with yourself, see where you're at?
I think people forget meditation doesn't have to be stopping. So meditation could be, I'm washing my hands and I'm smelling the soap and I'm feeling what the water feels like on my hands, and or I'm feeling my fingerprint and I can feel the ridges and the smoothness. And sometimes that's easier for people than like sit down and be quiet. I think a lot of times to start with, it is a lot easier. So little things like that, pulling in, okay, I'm driving. What am I seeing? What am I hearing? Those types of things are little things that are meditation, but they're not necessarily stopping. It's just becoming more aware of things.
That makes sense. Not getting home and being like, how did I get here? But just kind of experiencing that a little bit and being in that moment.
Mm-hmm. And even just noticing your breath where it starts and stops. Maybe you do a breathing exercise. Maybe you just notice it for 10 seconds while you're walking from one door to the next. That's meditation.
I totally agree. And that's been like, can even just one breath sometimes, like I said, I'm not good at this. I've been doing it for a long time and I'm still like, I don't know that I've gotten much better, but it's something. And so, sometimes just one breath, I know for me to be like, can I just focus on one inhale and exhale? Okay, next step.
I don't even know what being good at it means.
I love that you say that. You're right.
Even this stuff, I think that kind of goes into the perfectionism that sometimes the veterinary world lives in of, okay, now I have to do mental health perfectly.
It's so true.
The idea of this is just to notice here and there, right? If you're noticing here and there, then you're taking the power away from it and putting power back in yourself. If you fidget intentionally, right? Watch the movement of whatever your fidget might be, and then it does what it's supposed to do, as opposed to being in the back of your brain. None of this has to be perfect. You just have to play with it and decide what works for you.
Yes, this is a no pressure area.
Yeah, I think pressure makes it worse, right?
Yeah.
Now I'm stressed. I gotta be mentally well. What do I do now?
I didn't count to 4 on that inhale. My gosh. Well, kind of going back to this concept of trauma, I think certainly if we have, God forbid, like a hit by car and a young dog and we can't do anything, or something that we could treat, but we're limited by funds. And so maybe we have to talk euthanasia. Those are some of, to me, maybe the more obvious sources where we would absorb vicarious trauma. Are there other experiences that you've heard from veterinary professionals that maybe aren't such obvious sources of trauma?
Handlers. I think that's a big one people complain about, like the trauma of someone coming in and saying you're doing this for the money when you're trying to pay rent. Or some being yelled at and being like, where do I have a voice in this? That can be really unsafe if you don't know how to manage it. And even just leaving those and saying, that's them, not me. I know I'm not doing this for the money, or else I'd pick a different career, quite frankly.
I know. I've always said that when people, like, if anybody got into this for the money, like, the joke's on us.
But I think that's a big one. But even when you're in a room with an anxious animal, sometimes that can be traumatic, right? If they're responding in a way that feels anxiety provoking to you, whatever that means, that's going to be different for everyone that walks in the room. Your body's going to hold it differently. And I think this is a very individualized question around what can cause trauma. And it's really based off of, I don't know, everything that you've lived up until this moment right now. But I mean, anything could be, but I think those are the big ones.
But I think that makes a lot of sense what you're saying with the individualization, that it might look different for you than it looks for someone else. So, paying attention to where, those situations that maybe do make you feel a little more uncomfortable, feel a little bit more anxious, where are you in particular absorbing that trauma? And is there a way to kind of mitigate that to a point? I know, hearing you say like walking into a room with a stressed animal, absolutely. That is something that certainly gets to me. And I can relate to the feeling of going into an exam room towards the end of the day. And, maybe there have been several stressed animals in a row, and just that, like, I don't know, it starts to feel like there's just sand in my limbs. Like I'm just exhausted, and I'm like, I don't even want to try to go through this exam because it's just so hard to like move through it knowing that this animal is so anxious. And, of course, in fairness, like we try to make sure we're doing the anxiety meds and we're low stress handling and all of this. But sometimes despite all of that, you just have anxious animals there that you can work with, but it's still hard.
Yeah. And think about all that. If it's a bad day and everybody's anxious, and then you just shove it, jump in the car and get home, where you have some of their anxiety in your body, you have all of your anxiety in your body, and whatever you walk home to, that's a lot to hold.
It is. It is. Yeah. Now that this is like the thing about these conversations is when it seems, sort of obvious to when we put it in words, but it's that putting it in words that you're like, oh, yeah, I have experienced that. That does make a lot of sense. And now you can put a name on it and be able to deal with it in a much more healthy way.
Yeah. And your field is it's high stress and fast paced. So there's not a lot of time to do this stuff. But if someone, if you see one of your colleagues walk out with that blank stare on their face that people get sometimes, or they just seem like they're moving slow, or they look like their muscles are super tight, like they're about to fight someone, that might be the moment of like, why don't you go to the bathroom, take a breath, like I got you. And helping each other out, I think, is huge, because it's going to be hard to only check in on yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially, when we talked about, so many of us in this field do have, kind of an empathetic streak where we do absorb what's going on around us. So being observant of our team members. And I think somebody told me recently, they said, if you ask somebody, hey, how you doing? They say, fine. Like that's your cue. Like nobody's fine.
And the hard part is when we say, how are you doing? I think it's like society good.
Yeah. It's just that natural answer.
Yeah. But saying, gosh, you left a really hard case, why don't you go take a break?
Yeah.
Feels a lot better than how are you doing sometimes.
That's true. That's true. Just kind of observing what's happening and addressing it in real words, to say, not, how you doing after you just did that, but like, hey, I know that was hard. Why don't you take a breath?
Exactly.
Is there any way to avoid trauma associated with these type of situations, or is our focus more on understanding it and coping with it?
I don't think there's a way to avoid it. I think you can become more resilient to it. So the resiliency looks like, how much am I checking in on myself so that it's not piling up? How much am I taking a big exhale or a one breath or a intentional drink of water, that I can feel it in my body and what it's doing and all of these things? How many times am I checking in with, can I feel my body, or am I just rushing? Or what do my feet feel like on the ground? Whatever the thing that speaks to you is, how often am I doing that? Because the more you're checking in, the less the stuff's building up on each other.
That makes sense. I love that you bring up the example of the intentional drink of water. We all need to be reminded of that, not just in the veterinary field, but to stop and, eat some food, take a drink of water, go to the bathroom throughout the day. Don't just rush through your day. And at the end of the day, have you had anything to eat or drink or sat down for more than 10 seconds in the entire day? But taking those moments to check in and take care of yourself and what you're saying, I think what I'm hearing you say is like, that's the perfect time in these moments that we need to make sure we're taking care of ourselves anyway, is the perfect time to check in and say, how am I doing? Am I okay? And bring yourself back to that present moment.
Absolutely. And self-care is talked about so much in these big chunks of time. And I know when I get super busy in life, that's the thing that falls short. And so making sure you have a default mode of what's my quick thing I do throughout the day that takes 10 seconds. So I'm doing something even when I'm busy. And quite frankly, the reality is if you're doing the little things, you'll probably be able to do the big things better.
Absolutely. Yeah. Gosh, say that again for those in the back. Like that's so important to make sure we're doing the little things if we want to be able to do the big things. So if we're talking about the fact that these little T traumas, they're going to exist. It's the nature of certainly our jobs in the veterinary profession. It's probably just the nature of life for all of us. How we talked a little bit about checking in. We talked a lot of it about checking in and kind of making sure that we're taking care of ourselves throughout the day. Are there more, or I guess other specific strategies we should be keeping in mind to address those feelings when we do check in and say, I'm not totally okay right now?
You can seek help. I know that's hard. You have to find the right therapist. You have to find the time for a therapist. You have to do all of those things. I think even just checking in with each other can be really, really huge. Talking about how to build a healthy culture around, I need to go take a walk. I need to take a day off and use that day not just to lay in bed and watch Netflix. Well, maybe part of it. Okay, fine.
Maybe take 2 days and use one of them to watch Netflix.
Yeah. And then maybe another to say, okay, what do I need to do to enjoy my job from now on? What is it that I'm missing? And trying to catch it before it gets too big and all ton of work can be helpful, not always realistic. I think there's a lot of different pieces of stopping and saying, do I need to change anything in my job right now so that it speaks to me more? Do I need to, where do I need to tweak things so that things feel less big?
I think some of what I heard kind of in the beginning of that answer of seeking help and maybe taking some time off and this kind of stuff is like, martyring yourself and for the sake of your job, your patients, your coworkers, whatever it may be, it's only going to end up hurting you, hurting the individual in the long run, but probably it's going to reflect in job performance. It's going to reflect in interactions with peers and coworkers and things like that. And ultimately, probably everybody is going to suffer if we don't find some way to take that time, whether it's asking for time off or coming to management and saying, hey, can we talk about these changes, or coming to the doctor, who's on duty if you're, the technician, and say, hey, can we talk about the plan for this patient because I'm worried about something, the way that this is going, and trying to make that change, because just continuing to absorb that and not making time for ourselves is not, and not checking in and making sure we're okay is ultimately not going to benefit anybody in the long run.
Absolutely. If you broke your arm, you'd probably take time off work because it's obvious.
Right.
Right. I obviously cannot perform all my tasks without all of my limbs. But when it's mental health, people discredit it because it's not seen and it's not obvious, but it's not much different in a lot of ways because I'm moving slower. I'm making more mistakes. I'm irritable, all of these things are playing a role, and you're still not performing your job in the same capacity.
Or that negativity. I know that's something really common that can start to creep in of you get one frustrating client and forget every good client-patient interaction that we had that day. And that can happen certainly on an individual basis, but it can start to spread and then everybody's in a bad mood.
Yeah, I think that brings up a good point. Our magnetic fields, they've done actually research on this, and it's valid research. It's not super fruity. That our magnetic fields extend about 3 feet long. And so we actually share the space of anything within 3 feet of each other, whether we like to or not. And the best example I give, I think we've all been at the grocery store and been like, I'm really anxious next to this person. I don't know why. And it's us sharing a magnetic field, which makes a lot of sense because if we were out in the wild, we would need to communicate. There's a lion in the brush. Let's get out of here, without necessarily yelling it at the top of our lungs. And so our systems still perform in that same way. So we're really sharing that field. It's not just about the fact that we're saying negative things. And so everybody else is thinking negatively, although that plays a part. It's also when I'm anxious, the person next to me is more anxious, whether they realize it or not. And then that spreads a lot. And so the more regulated you are, the more regulated people around you are, that's going to spread as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of goes to say, like, we're not benefiting anybody by just kind of saying, oh, I'll just deal with it and I'll just, box it up. No, because that's just going to build up anxiety within you. And then it's going to spread to the people around you. And nobody's doing well in that situation.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I'm curious about the magnetic fields because it makes me think of like some of the nonverbal communication, which of course is important in veterinary medicine because our patients can't talk. Tell me more about the magnetic fields. This is interesting.
The people who have done a lot of the research is an organization called HeartMath. And they've done, they've put people in a room with an anxious person and put people in a room with a non-anxious person, and then tested their heart rates and how they do on tests and how they perform in different tasks. And it found some really valid stuff that upholds with the fact that if you're with a regulated person, you're more likely to be less anxious, you're more likely to perform well, you're more likely to do well with cognitive tasks than you are if there is someone in the room that is anxious.
That's really interesting. And I think it just speaks to our day-to-day interactions too. Like my kids tend to be better behaved when I'm in a better mood and not like anxious and irritable from the day.
Yeah, I think kids like read like 12 feet of our magnetic fields more than 3.
Absolutely. I would agree with that. But it's something to think about that, what you have going on might be contagious to a degree. So all the more reason to take care of yourself for your own well-being, but also for the well-being of everyone around us.
Absolutely. I think that also speaks to how much we are absorbing whoever's in the room, whether they be human or not. And if they are anxious about money, which is inevitable, that's not your fault, it just is, or anxious about their companion animal, or the animal's anxious because you're sticking a thermometer up their butt or whatever it might be, we're still absorbing that to an extent. It's not as big, but we're still absorbing that. And so it's hard to manage what's mine and what's theirs. And sometimes it's just leaving the room and going, gosh, my chest hurts. Is that mine or theirs? And surprisingly, our body knows more than we think when we ask the question.
But it's remembering to like check in and ask the question and say, what is this? I carry a lot in like my neck and my shoulders. And so I found myself where I think you said earlier, like you're ready to like hit somebody, and I'm not going to hit anybody, but like where my shoulders and my upper arms, and my neck are like so tense, and I'm almost sitting like hunched up in a little ball and having to check in and be like, why are my shoulders tired? Like it's not like I worked out or anything like that. And I'm like, oh, because I've been sitting here curled up in this tight little ball for who knows how long. And yeah, taking that breath and relaxing. And then I think your advice is really good to take that extra step of like, where did this come from? Why am I feeling this way right now? What have I experienced? What have I absorbed that's gotten me to this place right now?
Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's an obvious answer and sometimes it's not. But even just the ability to say, I'm an animal too. And so chances of me having some fight, flight, freeze, safety responses there might be, it's pretty good. And so maybe I don't want to fight people, but my muscles think I do.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes sense because that is what it's felt like sometimes. I feel like I'm like balled up ready to hit somebody. And of course, I'm not going to do that. But why do I feel this way? But you're right. Like that fight or flight is probably manifesting in a subconscious way.
So I can speak a little bit if you want to just kind of add something in to this idea of safety. So, there's a train of thought that I follow that is about 80% of our reactions come from our body more than our mind. But if I'm unsafe, my frontal cortex or problem solving thinking part of my brain is working less and my reacting part of my brain is working more. So even just bringing in cognitive tasks can sometimes create some safety if you're like, I cannot get safe, I cannot relax. So intentionally playing a computer game. Tetris has some interesting research behind it, actually.
I've heard that.
Doing a math problem, playing dumb car games that you would with your kids. How many red cars, how many yellow cars? Let's do the alphabet. Things that bring in that thinking part of your brain are going to bring in a little bit more safety if you're in this, I cannot get off of this ledge place.
So we take ourselves out of that emotional state and more into that thinking mind to help relax.
Yes.
And that's not always an easy thing to do. Like the last thing you want to do is like think, really think about things when you're hyped up in an emotional state. And it makes sense because it's if you're trying to use two different parts of your brain.
Yeah. If a bear walks into a room and someone says 2+2, you're going to say, I don't care. Like,
this is such an important thing to remember. And I've heard this in other contexts. And I've told this to my kids too, that we, like my 9-month-old puppy I love her so much, but my gosh, that, we're simple animals. And so things like positive reinforcement and remembering that like that fight or flight reflex is going to happen and that it's natural that we're going to react in certain ways it makes sense to me at least. And it helps me to think like, okay, it's not as complicated as I'm making it. Like think about the animals that we work with. Like if I, yell at her and I say, come here, puppy dog. And she's not going to come to me like, but that positive reinforcement is going to work. Well, the same is true for us in so many ways.
Absolutely. And if you think about it, at first, it takes a lot of intention and work to create this as part of your routine. But the more positive reinforcement it is, the more you're going to do it naturally. The same as the puppy, right? Eventually, you say, get in your crate or your place or whatever it is you use, and she's going to dote over there. Right now, it's a lot of work.
Right. And we can do the same thing with ourselves to say, like, okay, let's take ourselves out of this mindset and put us in the other mindset. And it's a lot of work. But we can also train our brains to make that switch and be in a little bit calmer state.
Yeah. And I think the simplest, the better. If you can simplify this, it's really not that complicated. Our brains have made it this complicated. If you can simplify it, then I think you'll succeed because it won't be short term.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense to keep it simple, make it easy, similar to how we would go about training my crazy puppy. And we work with animals and we understand these concepts in a lot of ways. So applying them back to ourselves to say, how can we positively enforce what we're doing? How can we make it a simple thing to get from A to B? How can we appreciate and understand that we're going to have certain visceral reactions in situations and be okay with that and train our brains to switch that off when we need to.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I think I had to learn in my job is your patients generally won't be mad if you're 2 to 3 minutes late. And taking 2 to 3 minutes can be the difference of doing a good job and a mediocre job.
And none of us want to do a mediocre job. That's the perfectionism.
Yeah. But we feel like we can't take 2 to 3 minutes. And again, I'm not mad at my vet's office if they're 2 to 3 minutes late. I probably don't even notice.
Right. That's a really good point to say, can we just take a beat and move from maybe one tough exam room to the next one? I'm thinking of those days full of anxious patients where, that 2 to 3 minutes really might make a huge difference.
And some people might say it adds up, and it might. Change it to 1 minute if you have to, but
make it simple.
Yeah, exactly.
Take a drink of water.
10 seconds. No one's going to notice.
Exactly. Well, I feel like I'm at risk here of like turning this into my own, like, okay, but tell me about this day that I had and unpacking some of the things that I've experienced. But to keep myself from doing that temptation, for people who are listening, if they can relate to some of what we're saying here and they realize, hey, maybe I am carrying around some of this vicarious trauma. And, certainly can try to implement some of the more simple techniques that we've talked about here. But maybe they realize like, no, I need help dealing with this. Mm-hmm. What sort of resources are available?
So there's your typical therapy sites. They might not understand veterinarians all the way, but Psychology Today has a therapy listing where you can say, this is the insurance that I have, and this is the therapy I'm interested in, and this is what I want to get out of it. If you're feeling like you want to take your own life, Not One More Vet is a wonderful resource for you. Unfortunately, that's more common than we like to admit in the veterinary field, but that's a wonderful resource that's nationwide that can help link you to someone that can help you out. And then, if you have an EAP, if you have an insurance, they can help link you. A little less work. Can't promise it's going to be a perfect fit, but at least it's something. And then a lot of the local veterinary associations. I know the Colorado one has some resources. The AVMA actually has some resources as well. And so going to those places that you're already linked up with, luckily the conversation of well-being is becoming more common in your field, which means more resources are available.
Absolutely. And I just want to expand on one of those because I recently became familiar with this term, but EAP, Employee Assistance Program. Can you expand on that a little bit and what that might mean and how employees might figure out if their hospital, their organization has an EAP?
So talking to your HR or whoever's in charge of your benefits would be a first step. An EAP is typically a certain number of sessions that you get that your employer pays for. So usually between 5 and 10 sessions, sometimes more, sometimes less, that are available to you through a certain program that is hired on their own therapist or contracted out their own therapist to say, go support these people.
And that might be, even if it is just 5 or 10 sessions, enough to just kind of hit, give you a release valve to say, okay, let me let some of this go and have somebody validate what I'm going through here.
And usually those short sessions are, here's some skills you can use, which is exactly what you need, right?
Right.
When we're in all of this crisis, we don't remember anything that I just said or that anybody said before. And I just need someone to say, hey, don't forget to breathe.
Right. Take a minute, take a drink of water and just bring yourself back.
Exactly.
And we talked about this a bit throughout our conversation here, but just to kind of round it out and remind all of us listening how important it is that we really function as a community and as a team, all kind of going back to being pack animals, like you mentioned before. Can you talk about supporting each other and how we can do a good job supporting each other? Because like you mentioned, feelings of wanting to take your own life are unfortunately very common in the veterinary field. So how can we make sure that we're checking in with each other and being as supportive as possible?
The first thing I would say is if you are afraid someone is struggling to a point that they might take their life, it is okay to ask them and to ask them straight, do you want to kill yourself? And that can be the most supportive phrase that people hear, surprisingly, and one of the hardest to ask. And so that would be the first and foremost. The other piece is if you're noticing someone just struggling a little or having a hard day or having a hard moment in their life, saying, I got you for this one thing. That doesn't mean you have to cover all of their things, but I got you. Go take a breath outside, whatever they like to do, tell them to go do it. Sometimes it's even just saying, hey, let's go get food together. We don't even have to talk about this, but at least you're connected to someone. And as a agency owner, if you are that, making sure that your staff feels comfortable enough and doesn't get punished for, I'm having a hard day. Granted, we don't want people to take advantage of that, but we still want to support them and finding a really good balance between, hey, I'm noticing that you're struggling right now. Let me support you. Why don't you take a day off? Or why don't you focus on this for a week or two, this part that you're really good at, so that we can get back to the stuff that you're less good at that you still have to do.
Right. Absolutely. And thinking of a situation, it's been a little while since a colleague of mine had a family emergency, and, I could see her kind of dealing with that in the moment. I would say if you're on the receiving end of that, someone coming to you and saying, hey, let me take this over for you. And let me get involved so you can take a break and you can go just have a moment and deal with what you need to deal with right now. It can be, I don't know, sometimes we have that Superman complex. It's like, no, I can do it. I can muscle through it. I can carry it all. But thinking of being the person who was offering to jump in and handle something for my colleague, like that felt really good to me when she said, okay, thank you. And she walked outside and she could deal with what she had to deal with. So I guess I would add to that, like if you're on the receiving end of that offer, it also feels good to the person who's making the offer when, for you to take them up on it and say, okay, thanks. Yeah, let me go take a breath. And, we're helpers. We like to help each other.
Exactly. And on that same note, asking someone what they need doesn't always work because we say nothing. I'm good.
Right. I'm good.
But actually saying, let me do this sometimes feels a lot better.
I never thought about it, but that absolutely makes sense. Like it just it breaks through that Superman complex a little bit to say, I'm going to do this specific thing for you.
Absolutely.
Well, Allison, this has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining me and for talking about big T trauma, little T trauma, vicarious trauma, and all of these things that are so relevant, certainly to us in the veterinary field and kind of, as you mentioned, in so many fields where we're exposed to this. Are there any final thoughts you want to share with us?
I think just don't forget to exhale. I mean, that's the simplest final thought, but so important.
Such a good thought. Absolutely. It's so easy to forget. Well, thank you again for joining me.
Yes, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed that talk. I know I certainly did. And a huge thank you to Allison for joining me. I really had a great time talking to you and learned a lot from this conversation. If you enjoyed this talk, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. It'll help other veterinary professionals like you find this and other great content we try to put out there. If you'd like more episodes like this, click on the Education tab on the Vetfolio website. As always, we'd love to hear your input on this talk, as well as ideas for topics you'd like to hear from us in the future. Feel free to reach out to me at dvm@vetfolio.com. You can also visit my Facebook page at Dr. Cassie DVM, and you can find me on LinkedIn. And remember, if one animal is better off because of you today, it's a great day.